Hi, everyone. Going to continue on the big ideas that I started yesterday. There are some big ideas that are very worth paying attention to and pursuing. And I've been talking about a book called Speaking of Jesus by Carl Medearis. Carl Medearis is a vineyard pastor, but he spent most of his life as a Christian in the Middle East, Lebanon, Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and other places, mostly in Lebanon, just talking about Jesus, bringing people very effectively to the knowledge of who he is and a pursuit of following him. And yesterday we talked about how the game that we often play, which is, this group of ideas against that group of ideas, this religion against that religion, and we kind of compare ourselves and say, how are we doing? How are we doing in comparison to the growth of, for instance, Islam or Buddhism or one of the other types of ideas, even atheism and agnosticism? And then, it causes a lot of insecurity, and we start wondering, how is the church doing? And like that's something that we should really be paying attention to. It's kind of above our pay grade. Carl Medearis says, picture it more like a soccer match where the Team Christian is battling it out and going head to head with Team Muslim. But then Jesus steps on the field, interrupting the game, and he begins calling Christians to follow him. Because, it's possible to call yourself a Christian and yet really not be following him on a daily, on a monthly, even throughout your whole lifetime. To call yourself a Christian and yet not be following Christ. And then he goes to the Muslims and he does the same thing, and he calls them to go and follow him. And Carl's point is that the work of Jesus is very often different than the work of the church. So, for instance, I said yesterday that the work of a pastor is to grow the church, right? Get it really big, get a smoke machine and all of that good stuff. But is Jesus really concerned with that? When he had large followings, he would often turn and give a teaching, and a good portion of the people would leave. That's completely contrary to the way that we think about the work of a minister today. But even more than that, he goes on and he says, the goal is really to get people connected with Christ, and to not just get them converted away from something, which is, again, sometimes the end goal of a lot of people is to show people how they're at fault, they're failing, they're miserable, they're messed up. And if we can just convince you of that, then maybe we can introduce Jesus. Well, what if we did it more Jesus style, where we went to messed up, muddled people like Peter, like Simon the Zealot, like Matthew the tax collector, and we just said, hey, or come and follow Jesus. Come and find out who he is. And what we find out is that there's a lot of people who are interested in that. Even though they might start in a place that we say, oh, they should really leave that place first before they start following him. The stories of an individual are very complex. So Carl, in this, is saying, talk about Jesus. Don't talk about your church. Don't talk about anything else. Don't talk about your great theology. First, all those things are wonderful. They can be a blessing, but further down the line. Now, Paul in 1 Corinthians says the same thing in chapter 3. He says, look, don't start with any other foundation than the foundation of Jesus Christ. If you're going to build anything on anything, you got to build it on a relationship with God the Father through Jesus. And from that, you can find that you can go much faster, much further than if you try and do it your own way. And so the big idea is to become, and I'll put it in terms that I love. I heard this from the pastor of the Anaheim Vineyard: become explorers and not experts. Instead of saying, oh man, I've studied Islam, I've studied Mormonism, I've studied atheism, and I know everything, all of their arguments and how to combat them. And I'll dismantle their beliefs and take them apart, and then I'll start to put in the good things, right? Well, why don't you find out what God has already been doing there? In other words, you follow Jesus and do the exact same thing that you're asking them to do. And so I'll just tell a story from this book that illustrates this, that our real command is to teach others how to follow him. That's the Great Commission. Doesn't matter if it's in our families, doesn't matter if it's at our workplaces, doesn't matter, if it's somewhere out in our neighborhoods. When we encounter people, we're exploring what God has already done in their lives so that we can aid them and assist them in following him who is the truth, the way, and the life. Now, that's something we need to take very seriously. He is the truth. Okay, truth is a person. He is the way. The pathway forward for you and the pathway forward for me is Jesus, and the ways that he's going to lead us is going to look very, very differently, but it's still all going to be encompassed in him. And then he is the life, the abundant life that we so crave and look for and try to satisfy in all sorts of other ways is going to be found in him. So let me give you a little story. Carl, after he had returned to the United States, was led back to the Middle East, and particularly to Iraq. And this is while the Gulf War was going on, not the Gulf War, excuse me, the occupation of Iraq by U.S. forces. And so it was not a convenient time, and it wasn't a safe time. But because he knew the Middle East, he was probably more confident than the average person. So he and a friend go, and they actually find themselves in Baghdad. And this is right after the U.S. forces had taken over the city. And he's talking to people, and when he's asked the question, why are you here? He says to this one individual, he says, well, my friend and I, we follow Jesus here. And the person looked at him and said, Jesus is here? And he said, yeah, we followed him here. Now, of course, we know that unlike Peter and unlike, James and John, they weren't following the physical person of Jesus, but they were following his intentions, his will, his love, his kindness, his word, all of these things by endeavoring to go to Iraq at this particular time to reveal the gospel. So they were following Jesus. But when they were asked the question, Jesus is here, they answered honestly and said, of course he's here. Of course, we know he's everywhere, but this is just a lovely story. So the person said, wait right here. Now, that would cause alarm in my heart. But what he ended up doing is he went and he got his father. And his father came. And unbeknownst to Carl and his friend, his father had been given cassette tapes years ago, which had nothing but the Gospels on them. And they had listened to the gospel stories, their family, over and over and over and over again. In other words, instead of being experts, they were explorers. They found out that God was doing a work in this family and had been doing it for literally years and years, and they had worn out these cassette tapes. They no longer worked. And so when Carl told this man that he could give him a book that had the same words that were on the cassette tape of the Gospels, he was excited, but he was also very careful. And so he took the New Testament, and he went and he sat in the corner of this hotel, and he opened it and began slowly reading it. After a couple of hours, he came and found Carl's room and told him, this is indeed the book that he had been received before, and he wanted to know more about following Jesus. And so their entire family was saved and baptized and led into the kingdom of God. So why is this such a great, big idea? Because if I go out and I have to rely on first my own competency, so how well do I understand every argument, everything that someone might say, well, I have an apt, biblical, fantastic comeback. The answer to that is, at my sharpest, possibly I could do an all right job, but who knows on a given day if I'm going to be that sharp. But that's a whole lot of pressure on me, an extreme amount of pressure on me to perform and do a really, really good job. If instead I get to walk humbly with my God and seek to show mercy, then I go out, and when I encounter someone, I can just ask them questions like, what do you know about Jesus? What has God done in your life? We can ask these basic questions, and then instead of being in the place where we're looking to be the expert and pick things apart and make sure that it's under our control, we're investigators, we're explorers, and instead we're going, oh my gosh, there's the opening. We're listening to people's hearts as well as their thoughts, and we're finding the intersection that God has already made into their lives. And so Paul earlier in 1 Corinthians talks about speaking things by the Spirit, that there are these deep things of God that when we're connected to the presence of God, the Spirit of God, we're able to then speak into other people's lives. And I think that again is really central to what Carl is saying here, this big idea that you can follow him and you can call others to follow him, and that there's a working of God that is far bigger, far more masterful. So I'm going to use this illustration in closing, one of my favorites that I came up all on my own. So proud of this. But, if you can just imagine a little boy or a little girl helping dad or helping mom. So let's use dad, for example. So dad is going to be on a ladder. He's going to be redoing a light fixture, and he's asking for the child to reach into the toolbox and give him certain tools. So the child doesn't understand the work that's being done, doesn't understand electricity, doesn't understand wiring. He's probably, or she is learning the names of the tools, Phillips head screwdriver, wrench, who knows, whatever it is, and handing it to the father. It's the father's work, but there's an immense joy and pride and satisfaction and purpose that's found in helping someone who is the expert complete their work. And the interesting thing is you get to walk away from those experiences with this understanding that, yes, you are doing the work of your father, but also that you were able to rely on him. You didn't have to have all the answers. Carl speaks about this, and he does such a great job in this book. And I love it when people are able to move not just in expertise and competency, and yes, he knows all kinds of languages, and that's really exciting, and that helps him certainly, but that he's really relying on following after Jesus, just finding out and investigating what God is doing. So I hope you have a fantastic Friday, and God bless you, and I'll see you again soon.